They say pride comes before the fall. But in the underworld, pride comes before you lose everything you've ever loved. It was 2 a.m. The rain was coming down in sheets, and they had just had the screaming match of the decade in a damp parking garage. He rolled up the tinted window of his Maybach, looked his furious wife in the eye, and coldly told his driver to pull away, leaving her standing alone in the dark. He thought he was teaching her a lesson. He thought she'd just call a cab. But when the sun rose, her side of the bed was cold, and she was gone. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was suffocatingly warm, despite the vaulted ceilings and the chill of the November Chicago wind howling against the glass. The annual Lakeshore Charity Gala was a playground for the city's elite. Politicians, real estate moguls, and the silent heavy hitters of the underworld who wore Tom Ford suits to mask the blood on their hands. Among them stood Matteo Falcone. To the mayor, Matteo was a generous philanthropist who funded orphanages. To the FBI, he was the untouchable head of the Falcone crime syndicate, a man who controlled the docks, the unions, and the underground casinos from the south side to the city limits. And to Clara, he was a husband who was slowly slipping away into the darkness he had promised to leave behind. Clara stood by the champagne fountain, the ice-blue silk of her designer gown clinging to her frame, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a crystal flute. She was 28, radiant but visibly exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes couldn't be completely hidden by expensive makeup. Being a Mafia wife was an exercise in chronic anxiety, a life spent waiting for a phone call from the police, the coroner, or a rival boss. Matteo was across the room, leaning casually against a marble pillar, deep in conversation with Thaddeus Russell, his ruthless underboss. Clara watched as Matteo nodded, a dark, dangerous smirk playing on his lips. Thaddeus handed him a burner phone. Matteo glanced at the screen, his expression hardening into a cold, dead stare that Clara knew all too well. It was the look he got when someone had crossed a line. It was the look that meant violence. Clara set her glass down with a sharp clink and navigated through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood. "Matteo," she said, her voice low but laced with an undeniable edge as she approached the two men. Thaddeus immediately stepped back, lowering his head in a show of respect. "Mrs. Falcone, you look lovely tonight." "Leave us, Thad," Clara ordered, not taking her eyes off her husband. Thaddeus looked at Matteo for confirmation. Matteo gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and the underboss vanished into the crowd. Matteo turned to his wife, adjusting his cuffs. "Is there a problem, Clara?" "You're causing a scene," he murmured, his voice a smooth, gravelly baritone that used to send shivers down her spine for entirely different reasons. "A scene? You want to talk about a scene?" Clara hissed, stepping closer so her voice wouldn't carry over the jazz band playing in the corner. "My brother called me 20 minutes ago in a total panic. Federal agents raided his logistics warehouse this afternoon. Matteo. The warehouse you swore you weren't using for your shipments anymore." Matteo's jaw tightened. "Keep your voice down. This isn't the time or the place." "It is exactly the place," she countered, tears of frustration pricking the corners of her eyes. "You promised me, Matteo. 5 years ago, when we got married, you looked me in the eyes and said you were going legitimate. You said you wouldn't drag my family into the crossfire. And now, you've been running smuggled firearms through Peter's shipping containers. If he goes to federal prison because of you, he's not going to prison," Matteo interrupted, his tone sharp and authoritative. I have the Port Authority and the local judges in my pocket. It's a minor hiccup, a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? They found crates of untraceable automatic weapons. Clara's chest heaved. You lied to me. Every night you came home and kissed my forehead. You were putting a target on my family's back. Matteo grabbed her elbow, his grip firm, pulling her out of the main ballroom and into a dimly lit, velvet-lined corridor that led to the VIP lounge. His dark eyes flared with a mix of anger and injured pride. I do what I have to do to protect our empire, he growled, cornering her against the wall. You think this lifestyle pays for itself? You think the mansion in the Gold Coast, the diamonds on your neck, the security detail keeping you safe from the Russians comes from legitimate real estate? Grow up, Clara. You knew who I was when you walked down that aisle. Clara stared up at him. The man she loved, feeling like she was looking at a complete stranger. I knew a man who wanted better for himself. Now I just see a thug in an expensive suit. You're turning into your father, Matteo. It was the ultimate insult. Matteo's father had been a vicious, paranoid boss who eventually drove his own wife to suicide before being gunned down in a barber shop. Matteo flinched, as if she had physically struck him. The silence that stretched between them was heavy, toxic, and suffocating. Get your coat, Matteo said, his voice dropping to a terrifying deadpan whisper. We're leaving. I'm not going anywhere with you. Clara shot back, lifting her chin defiantly. You are my wife, Matteo said, stepping into her personal space, his imposing height casting a long shadow over her. And you will not disrespect me in public. We are going home. Now. Clara ripped her arm from his grasp and turned on her heel, storming down the corridor toward the private elevators. Matteo followed closely behind, the air around them thick with unspoken threats and boiling resentment. The fight was far from over. It was only just moving underground. The private subterranean parking garage of the Drake Hotel was a stark contrast to the glamour above. It was damp, echoing, and smelled faintly of gasoline and wet concrete. The rain had picked up outside, pounding against the concrete ramp that led up to the street level. Frank Marino, Matteo's loyal driver and bodyguard, stood at attention beside the gleaming black Maybach 62. Seeing his boss and the boss's wife storming out of the elevator, Frank immediately opened the rear passenger door, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He had survived 20 years in the Falcone family by knowing exactly when to look the other way. Clara stopped 10 feet from the car. The underground lighting cast harsh, pale shadows across her face. Get in the car, Clara, Matteo ordered, stopping beside the open door. No, she said, her voice echoing off the concrete pillars. Not until you call Thad right now. Tell him to wipe Peter's name from those shipping manifests. Tell him you're taking the fall for the guns, not my brother. Matteo let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. Are you out of your mind? You're giving me an ultimatum. Here? Now? I'm telling you to fix the mess you made, Clara shouted, her composure completely shattering. If you don't call him right now and fix this, I am done, Matteo. I will walk out of here, and I will not come back to that house. Matteo's pride was a fragile, volatile thing. In his world, showing weakness was a death sentence. Being dictated to by his wife, especially in front of one of his men, was an unbearable insult to his authority. The alcohol in his system amplified his stubbornness, blinding him to the pain in her eyes. You're acting like a hysterical child, Matteo spat. Frank, get in the car. Frank hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing nervously between the furious Mafia boss and his desperate wife before sliding into the driver's seat. "Matteo, I mean it," Clara said, taking a step backward toward the exit ramp. The wind whipped down the tunnel, blowing her hair across her face. She was shivering, the thin silk of her dress providing no protection against the freezing Chicago night. "Choose. Your ego or your marriage." Matteo stared at her. He saw her shivering. He saw the tears mixing with her makeup. But the demon on his shoulder whispered that if he caved now, he would lose her respect forever. He had to break her defiance. He had to show her who was in control. "You want to walk?" Matteo said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Then walk." Clara's breath hitched. She stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to break, to rush forward and wrap his coat around her like he used to do. But Matteo just stood there, a statue of cold, unrelenting stone. Without another word, Matteo slid into the back of the Maybach and slammed the heavy armored door shut. The sound echoed through the garage like a gunshot. Inside the soundproof cabin, Matteo looked out the tinted window. He could see Clara standing there, looking small and fragile. "Boss?" Frank asked quietly from the front seat, looking through the rearview mirror. "You want me to wait? Or, I can call another car for the missus." "Drive, Frank," Matteo barked. "But boss, it's pouring out there, and this neighborhood at this hour—" "I said drive," Matteo roared, slamming his fist against the leather partition. "She wants to throw a tantrum. Let her walk it off. She'll call an Uber, or she'll be waiting at the front gates by the time we get home, crying and apologizing. Let's go." The Maybach's engine purred to life. The heavy luxury vehicle pulled away, its red taillights illuminating Clara's tear-stained face for a fleeting moment before it rounded the corner and headed up the ramp. Clara stood in the empty, echoing garage, the sound of the engine fading into the roar of the rain. A profound, hollow numbness washed over her. She pulled her phone from her small clutch purse, intending to call her friend Evelyn Carter. But as she unlocked the screen, her phone buzzed with a low battery warning and promptly died, the screen turning pitch black. She let out a frustrated sob, the sound swallowed by the vast, empty space. Gathering the hem of her expensive gown, she turned and began the long, cold walk up the ramp toward the unforgiving streets of Chicago. The rain hit her instantly, soaking her to the bone. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice in her chest. The Maybach pulled into the circular driveway of the Falcone estate in the Gold Coast just before 3 a.m. Matteo marched through the grand double doors, completely ignoring the greetings of his armed night security. He poured himself 3 fingers of Macallan 25 in his study, downing it in one burning gulp. He expected his phone to ring at any second. He expected Clara to call, demanding a ride, or for the front gate intercom to buzz with her arrival. But his phone remained silent. "Stubborn woman," he muttered to himself, unbuttoning his shirt and ascending the sweeping mahogany staircase. Let her freeze. She'll learn. Matteo fell into their massive, king-sized bed, the alcohol dragging him down into a heavy, dreamless sleep. When he woke, the morning sun was piercing through the gap in the heavy blackout curtains. He groaned, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. He reached out instinctively to the other side of the bed. The sheets were perfectly flat. The pillows were uncreased. The bed was cold. Matteo sat up, blinking away the sleep. "Clara," he called out. Silence. He threw off the covers and walked into her massive walk-in closet. Her everyday clothes were untouched. Her jewelry boxes sat undisturbed on the vanity. He checked the master bathroom. Empty. A slight prickle of unease started at the base of his neck, but he brushed it off. She probably stayed at Evelyn's house, he reasoned, or she checked herself into a suite at the Peninsula to make a point. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand. 9:15 a.m. No missed calls, no angry texts. He dialed Clara's number. It went straight to voicemail. "You've reached Clara. Leave a message." He hung up and dialed again. Voicemail. Frowning, Matteo scrolled through his contacts and hit the call button for Evelyn Carter, Clara's closest friend and confidant. Evelyn picked up on the third ring. "Matteo," Evelyn said, her tone cautious and slightly surprised. She knew about their marital issues. Clara told her everything. "Avi," Matteo said, trying to keep his voice casual, masking the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. "Is Clara with you? We had a bit of a disagreement last night, and she took off. There was a pause on the other end of the line. No, Matteo, I haven't seen Clara since the gala. I left early around 1 a.m. She didn't come to my place. Why, is she not home?" The prickle at the base of Matteo's neck turned into an icy spike, driven straight down his spine. "No, she's not. I assumed she called you." "She didn't call me." Evelyn's voice rose in pitch, taking on a frantic edge. "Matteo, you left her alone, in the city, in the middle of a storm. I thought she'd grab a cab," Matteo stammered, the realization of his catastrophic mistake finally crashing down on him. "Her phone is off, Matteo. Clara never turns her phone off," Evelyn yelled. "If something happened to her—" Matteo hung up the phone. The air in the bedroom suddenly felt entirely too thin. He sprinted downstairs, ignoring the bewildered looks of his house staff, and burst into the security control room. "Bring up the gate logs!" Matteo barked at the two guards sitting at the monitors. "Did my wife come through here last night?" The head guard, a burly ex-Marine named Keller, scrambled to pull up the data. "No, Mr. Falcone. Only your car entered at 2:54 a.m. No one else has come in or out." Matteo's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pulled out his phone and dialed Thaddeus Russell. "Thad," Matteo said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual calm authority. "Get every man we have on the streets. Now." "Boss? What's going on?" Thaddeus asked, the sleep instantly vanishing from his voice. "Clara is missing," Matteo choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I left her at the Drake Hotel parking garage around 2:30 a.m. Track her phone. Pull every city traffic camera, every ATM camera, every storefront feed, from Lakeshore Drive to the Gold Coast. I want to know exactly where she walked." "Consider it done, boss. We'll find her," Thaddeus assured him. For the next 2 hours, the Falcone Syndicate mobilized like an army preparing for war. Matteo paced his study like a caged tiger, drinking black coffee that tasted like acid. He envisioned rival gangs, the Chicago Bratva, the West Side crews, snatching her off the street to use as leverage. He envisioned a random mugging gone wrong. Every scenario was worse than the last, and they were all entirely his fault. At 11:45 a.m., Matteo's phone rang. It was Thaddeus. "Boss," Thaddeus said, his voice tight, lacking its usual confidence. "We found something." "Where is she?" Matteo demanded, gripping the edge of his mahogany desk so hard his knuckles turned white. "We don't have her, boss, but my guys retraced the route from the Drake. 2 blocks north of the hotel, there's a narrow alleyway behind an old jazz club. The cameras on the street corner were shot out, but—" Thaddeus swallowed audibly. "But what, Thad? Tell me!" Matteo roared. "We found her clutch purse, boss, and her phone. It was smashed against the brick wall." Thaddeus paused, and Matteo could hear the heavy hesitation in his underboss's breath. "Matteo, there's a lot of blood on the pavement, and scuff marks, like someone was dragged." The phone slipped from Matteo's hand, clattering onto the hardwood floor. The walls of his study seemed to close in on him. The absolute, unassailable power he had wielded for a decade, the money, the men, the guns, the fear he instilled in others, meant absolutely nothing. Because of his pride, because he refused to yield in a petty argument, he had left the only woman he ever loved alone in the dark. And now, the darkness had swallowed her whole. The alleyway behind the Green Mill Cocktail Lounge in uptown Chicago was cordoned off not by the Chicago Police Department, but by men in heavy wool overcoats bearing the discreet, unspoken insignia of the Falcone Syndicate. The rain from the previous night had slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle, washing away the grime of the city, but failing to cleanse the dark stain on the asphalt. Matteo's black SUV tore around the corner of Broadway and Lawrence, ignoring the red lights, and screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley. He threw the door open before the vehicle had fully stopped, his bespoke Brioni suit instantly dampening in the mist. He pushed past his own guards, his eyes wild, his breathing shallow and rapid. Thaddeus Russell was waiting for him under the dripping fire escape, an umbrella held over a small, designated area of the pavement. Beside him squatted Dr. Alistair Finch, a disgraced former medical examiner who now exclusively handled the Falcone family's messes. "Show me," Matteo demanded, his voice a gravelly rasp that tore at his throat. Thaddeus stepped aside, lowering the umbrella just enough. Matteo's knees nearly buckled. There, amidst the discarded cigarette butts and shattered glass of a broken beer bottle, was Clara's silver clutch. The delicate, jewelled clasp she had complained was too difficult to open was smeared with a thick, dark substance. A few feet away lay the remnants of her iPhone, its screen a spiderweb of shattered glass. But it was the ground itself that paralyzed him. A deep, rust-colored smear trailed from the wall of the jazz club toward the street, a visceral testament to a violent struggle. The rain washed most of it out. "Boss," Dr. Finch said, his tone clinically detached, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "But based on the coagulation and the dispersion pattern, I'd estimate she lost about a pint. It's a head wound or a superficial laceration. If an artery had been hit, there would be arterial spray on the brickwork. She was struck, she fell, and then she was dragged." "Dragged," Matteo repeated, the word tasting like bile. He looked up, his dark eyes scanning the claustrophobic brick walls. "Where are the cameras?" "Shot out," Thaddeus replied grimly, pointing to the shattered lens of a security dome mounted above the club's rear exit. "Professional job. They knew the blind spots. They waited for her, Matteo. This wasn't a random mugging. A mugger takes the purse and the phone and runs. They left the valuables and took the girl." Matteo slowly crouched down, his expensive trousers soaking up the filthy water of the alley. He reached out with a trembling, gloved hand and picked up the ruined silver clutch. He could almost smell her perfume, Tom Ford's black orchid, mingling with the metallic stench of the blood and the wet garbage. A sound escaped him, something between a sob and a snarl, a terrifying noise that made even his hardened men take a synchronized step back. "Who?" Matteo whispered to the asphalt. Then he stood, spinning around, his face a mask of absolute, unadulterated fury. "Who knew she would be walking here? Who knew I left her at the Drake?" "Nobody, boss," Thaddeus said quickly, holding his hands up defensively. It was a spontaneous argument. No one could have predicted you'd drive off. Then they were watching the hotel, Matteo concluded, his mind racing, piecing the tactical puzzle together with the cold, lethal logic that had made him the king of the city. They saw her leave. They tailed her. They waited until she hit a dark spot. He grabbed Thaddeus by the lapels of his coat, slamming the underboss against the wet brick wall. "I want the city locked down, Thad. I want the ports frozen. I want the rail yards scoured. Nobody moves a single crate or a single car out of Cook County without my explicit permission. Do you understand? Matteo, if we shut down the transit lines, we bleed millions." Thaddeus choked out, struggling against Matteo's iron grip. "The union bosses will revolt." "Let them revolt!" Matteo roared, his voice echoing off the buildings, terrifying a flock of pigeons into the grey sky. "If my wife is not back in my bed by midnight, I will burn this city to the ground, and I will start with anyone who tells me about lost profits. Tell the unions, tell the politicians, tell the cops on our payroll. Find her." He released Thaddeus, shoving him aside. Matteo pulled out his phone, dialing a number he reserved only for extreme emergencies. It was Captain Harrison Fordell, the highest-ranking corrupt officer in the CPD's Organized Crime Division. "Fordell!" Matteo barked the moment the line connected. "My wife was taken. Uptown. Sometime between 2:45 and 3:30 a.m. There was a heavy sigh on the other end. "Jesus Christ, Falcone. Are you sure? Have you checked the hospitals?" "I don't pay you to ask me stupid questions, Harrison," Matteo growled. "I'm sending you the location. Get your loyal men out here. Run the tire tracks in the mud at the end of the alley. Check the city's automated license plate readers within a 5-mile radius. I want a list of every panel van, every SUV, and every blacked-out vehicle that left this grid in that 45-minute window." Matteo, doing that without a warrant, unofficially. "It's going to draw eyes from the feds," Fordell warned. "If you don't do it, I'll send my men to your house in Evanston and have a chat with your lovely wife, Susan, about how her husband affords his boat," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a dead, emotionless whisper that conveyed his absolute seriousness. "Do it." He hung up, staring back down at the blood. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing his lungs. He had left her. His pride had left her bleeding in an alleyway. "Boss," a rough voice called out. It was Frank, the driver, jogging down the alley, holding a clear plastic evidence bag. "One of our sweeps a block over found this, kicked down into a storm drain." Matteo snatched the bag. Inside, dripping with sewer water, was a heavily modified Glock 19. But it wasn't the gun that caught Matteo's eye. It was the customized grip. It was etched with a very specific, crude, double-headed eagle, the crest of the Volkov Bratva. Thaddeus stepped forward, his eyes widening. "Viktor Ozerov. The Russians. They're retaliating for the territory dispute on the south side." Matteo stared at the eagle, his jaw clenching so hard he thought his teeth might crack. Viktor Ozerov was a brutal, old-school mobster who believed in torture as a negotiation tactic. If Viktor had Clara, she wasn't just being held for ransom. She was being punished. "Gather the strike teams," Matteo said, his voice terrifyingly calm now. The panic had receded, replaced by a cold, homicidal clarity. "We're going to River North. We're going to pay Mr. Ozerov a visit at his bathhouse." The Odessan bathhouse in River North was a front, an open secret among Chicago's elite who enjoyed high-stakes underground poker and the company of trafficked Eastern European women. By 2 p.m., the luxury establishment was a smoking ruin. Matteo sat in the back of his armored Maybach, wiping a fleck of someone else's blood from his cheek with a silk handkerchief. Behind him, the wails of ambulance sirens pierced the afternoon air as paramedics dragged the bruised and battered remnants of the Volkov crew out onto the sidewalk. Matteo had broken Viktor Ozarov's hands himself, snapping the fingers one by one with a pair of steel pliers until the Russian boss wept and swore on his mother's grave that he knew nothing about Clara. And Matteo believed him. A man in agonizing pain eventually tells the truth, and Victor's confusion had been genuine. The Glock 19 in the storm drain had been a plant, a misdirection. Someone was trying to start a war between the Italians and the Russians while they slipped away with Clara in the chaos. It wasn't them, Matteo said to Thaddeus, as the underboss slid into the seat beside him. The interior of the car smelled of cordite and sweat. Victor could be lying, Thaddeus suggested, wiping sweat from his brow. He's a hard bastard. He wasn't lying, Matteo replied softly, staring blankly at the partition. Someone is playing us, Thad. Someone smart. Someone who knows my temper. They knew I'd see that eagle and immediately burn the Volkovs to the ground. Before Thaddeus could answer, Matteo's private cell phone, the encrypted one only his wife, Thaddeus, and his offshore banker possessed, vibrated in his breast pocket. Matteo froze. He pulled it out. Unknown caller. He answered, putting it on speakerphone, his heart hammering in his throat. Speak! A harsh, metallic, screeching sound filled the cabin, like metal grinding against metal, followed by the heavy, echoing drip of water. Then a voice spoke. It wasn't Russian. It wasn't local Chicago. It was a thick, grating South Boston brogue. Well, if it isn't the King of Chicago, the voice mocked. I hear you've been tearing up the city, Falcone, smashing up bathhouses. Naughty boy. Matteo's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Declan Murphy. Declan was an Irish enforcer, a mercenary who had been exiled from the East Coast for being too unpredictable, too violent even for the mob. He was a ghost, a man who only surfaced when a very high-paying, very dirty contract was put out. In the flesh, so to speak, Declan chuckled. If you touch one hair on her head, Declan, I will skin you alive and feed you to the stray dogs, Matteo said, the threat vibrating with absolute certainty. Oh, the lovely Clara is fine. A bit of a headache, maybe. Turns out she's quite the fighter. Chipped one of my boy's teeth before we got her in the van, Declan said lazily. But let's get down to business. I don't want your money, Matteo, and I don't care about your little territory wars. Then what do you want? I want the federal evidence from the warehouse raid, Declan demanded. The logs, the shipping manifests, the flash drives your boy took from the Port Authority server before the feds could seize it. I want the digital footprint of those guns. Matteo frowned, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. The guns? You kidnapped my wife over a shipment of rifles. They aren't just rifles, mate, and they don't belong to you, Declan growled, dropping the playful tone. They belong to a very powerful cartel down south, and your idiot brother-in-law got them flagged. Now, you're going to hand over the evidence, so my employers can scrub their connection, or I'm going to start sending your wife back to you in small, bloody parcels. How did you know about the raid? Matteo asked, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly shifting in his mind. The raid happened yesterday afternoon. It wasn't in the papers. It hasn't hit the news. The only people who knew about my brother-in-law's warehouse being hit were me, Peter, and my inner circle. Silence hung on the line for a terrible, stretching moment. Like I said, Declan murmured, a smirk audible in his voice. Your house is out of order, Falcone. You've got 24 hours to gather the drives. I'll text the drop location. Come alone or the missus gets a shallow grave." The line went dead. Matteo sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the city outside the thick bulletproof glass faded into nothingness. He looked down at the phone in his hand, then slowly turned his head to look at Thaddeus Russell. Thaddeus had been his right hand for a decade. He had been the one to orchestrate the movement of the guns. He had been the one to suggest using Peter's warehouse, claiming it was the safest route. And he had been the one standing next to Matteo when the argument with Clara broke out at the gala. "Irish mercenaries," Thaddeus said, shaking his head, looking disgusted. "I'll get the men ready. We'll trace the call. We'll tear this city apart, block by block." Matteo observed Thaddeus. He watched the micro-expressions on his underboss's face, the slight twitch of the jaw, the way Thaddeus avoided direct eye contact, focusing instead on the window. "No," Matteo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "No, we won't trace the call." "What? Boss, we have to—" "Thaddeus," Matteo interrupted gently. "Where were you last night after the gala?" Thaddeus blinked, taken aback. I went home, boss, to my place in Lincoln Park. You know this. I was asleep when you called me this morning." Matteo nodded slowly. "Right. Lincoln Park." He reached into his coat and pulled out his secondary burner phone, pulling up the GPS tracking logs he had quietly requested from his tech guy while they were raiding the Russian bathhouse. He hadn't just tracked Clara's phone, he had tracked the phones of his top lieutenants. Paranoia was a survival trait in his business. "It's funny, Thad," Matteo said, his eyes locking on to Thaddeus with the intensity of a predator cornering its prey. "Because the cell towers pinged your secondary phone in Uptown, 2 blocks away from the Green Mill, at exactly 3:15 a.m. The air in the car turned instantly toxic. Thaddeus froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pallid grey. He opened his mouth to speak, to formulate a lie, but the absolute, murderous certainty in Matteo's eyes silenced him. "You tipped them off," Matteo whispered, the realization a physical blow to his chest. "You set up Peter to take the fall with the feds, so I would be distracted. And when Clara walked out of that garage, you saw an opportunity to break me completely." "Matteo, you're not thinking straight," Thaddeus stammered, his hand inching slowly toward the inside of his jacket, where he kept his shoulder holster. "Don't," Matteo warned softly. Frank, sitting in the driver's seat, had already drawn his weapon and was pointing it directly at the back of Thaddeus's head through the open partition. "You're weak, Matteo," Thaddeus suddenly spat, abandoning the lie, his fear morphing into desperate venom. "You've gone soft since you married her. You're trying to go legitimate, turning down millions in cartel contracts to keep her hands clean. The family is bleeding money because of your conscience. I did what had to be done to secure our future." Matteo didn't shout. He didn't scream. He simply leaned forward, his face inches from the man who had stood beside him at his wedding. "Where is she, Thad?" "Go to hell," Thaddeus sneered. "Declan will kill her the second I don't check in." Matteo nodded once. "Frank, pull into the abandoned rail yard off Cicero. It's time Thaddeus and I had a private conversation." The abandoned Cicero rail yard was a graveyard of rusted boxcars and forgotten industry, hidden away from the prying eyes of the city beneath the shadow of a crumbling overpass. The rain had started again, a relentless, icy downpour that beat against the roof of the Maybach like a drum roll. Matteo stood in the mud, the heavy rain plastering his hair to his forehead and ruining his suit. He didn't feel the cold. He didn't feel anything except a burning atomic rage. Thaddeus Russell was strapped to a heavy wooden chair they had dragged from a derelict dispatcher's office. His tailored suit was torn, his face a bruised, bloody mess. Matteo had taken his time. He had used a pair of heavy iron knuckles, breaking Thaddeus's ribs one by one, methodical and precise. "I'll ask you one last time, Thad," Matteo said, his chest heaving, his knuckles aching and raw. "Where is the drop?" Thaddeus coughed violently, spitting a stream of blood and saliva onto the muddy ground. His left eye was swollen shut, but his right eye glared at Matteo with unyielding defiance. "Even if I tell you, you're dead. The cartel backed this play. They wanted the guns back, and they wanted you out. Declan has 20 men heavily armed. You walk in there. You're a dead man." "I am already dead," Matteo said softly. "I died the second I left her in that garage. Now I'm just the ghost coming to collect the debt." "The location, Thaddeus?" "Fulton Market," Thaddeus wheezed, the pain finally breaking his resolve. He slumped forward against the ropes. "The old Hammond meatpacking plant, sub-level 2, the freezer floors. They're waiting for you there." Matteo stared at his former best friend. There was a time he would have died for this man. In the Mafia, loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and betrayal was the ultimate sin. Matteo pulled the sleek, suppressed Heckler and Koch USP from his waistband. Thaddeus looked up, seeing the gun, and a flicker of genuine terror finally broke through his bravado. "Matteo, we were brothers." "My brother is dead," Matteo replied, his voice devoid of any inflection. He raised the weapon and squeezed the trigger twice. The silenced thwip-thwip barely registered over the sound of the rain. Thaddeus slumped forward, lifeless. Matteo turned away without a second glance. "Frank, call Lucas. Tell him to gather the Ghost Squad. Heavy armor, assault rifles, incendiaries. We're breaching Fulton Market in 20 minutes." The drive to the West Loop was a blur. Matteo cleaned his hands with a wet wipe, reloaded his sidearm, and strapped a Kevlar vest tightly over his ruined dress shirt. His mind was entirely focused on Clara. He prayed she was alive. He prayed she hadn't suffered. But mostly, he prayed for the opportunity to look her in the eyes and beg for her forgiveness before the night was over. The Hammond meatpacking plant was a massive Gothic structure of brick and iron, its windows boarded up, stinking of decay and forgotten blood. It was a fortress. Matteo's tactical team, the Ghost Squad, a highly trained unit of ex-military mercenaries strictly on his payroll, surrounded the perimeter. Lucas, a massive man with a scar running down his neck, handed Matteo an M4 carbine. "Thermal imaging shows a cluster of heat signatures on sub-level 2, boss," Lucas reported over the headset. 6 tangos on the perimeter, maybe a dozen more inside. We have to breach fast. "No survivors," Matteo ordered. "Except Declan. Save him for me." The breach was a masterclass in synchronized violence. They hit the reinforced steel doors of the loading dock with a shaped C4 charge. The explosion blew the heavy doors off their hinges, sending a shockwave of dust and concrete through the damp air. Before the smoke could clear, Matteo and his men flooded the corridor, their weapons cutting through the dark with lethal precision. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed concrete hallways. The Irish mercenaries were heavily armed, returning fire with automatic weapons, pinning Matteo's men behind rusted industrial meat hooks and concrete pillars. Matteo moved like a man possessed. The tactical caution he usually exercised was gone. He pushed forward, his M4 barking in short, controlled bursts, dropping 2 men in tactical gear who tried to flank them near the freight elevator. He could feel bullets whizzing past his ears, chipping the brickwork beside his head. But he didn't flinch. They descended the stairwell into the sub-levels, the air growing noticeably colder. This was the freezer level, a labyrinth of thick insulated walls and heavy hanging chains. "Covering fire!" Lucas yelled, tossing a flashbang into the main processing room. The blinding white light and concussive blast incapacitated the remaining guards. Matteo breached the room, sweeping his rifle across the expansive, freezing space. Declan's men lay groaning on the ground, and Lucas's squad moved in to secure them. But Matteo wasn't looking at the guards. His eyes were frantically scanning the room for a chair, a hostage, a sign of her. At the far end of the processing floor, illuminated by a single swinging utility light, was a heavy steel chair bolted to the floor. Ropes lay slack around its base. A puddle of water and a discarded jacket sat next to it. The chair was empty. "Clear!" Lucas shouted from across the room. "Area secure, boss!" Matteo sprinted toward the chair, his heart plummeting into his stomach. "Where is she?" he screamed, grabbing one of the wounded mercenaries by the collar and hoisting him up. "Where is my wife?" The mercenary spat blood, grinning wickedly. "She's a slippery one. We untied her to feed her. She stabbed O'Malley with a piece of rusted pipe, ran into the ventilation shafts. Find her," Matteo ordered his men, dropping the bleeding man. "Tear the walls down if you have to." He turned, shining the tactical light mounted on his rifle into the dark corners of the expansive freezer. "Clara!" he yelled, his voice cracking, desperate and raw. "Clara, it's me. You're safe." Only the echo of his own voice replied. He moved toward the back of the room, near a large industrial drainage grate. His boot caught on something on the ground. He looked down. It was a small, bloody piece of ice-blue silk, torn from the hem of her gala dress. Beside it lay a heavy steel crowbar, and just beyond that, the heavy steel door of a walk-in deep freezer was slightly ajar. Matteo pushed the heavy door open, stepping into the absolute, freezing darkness. "Clara," he whispered. From the shadows behind the hanging slabs of frozen beef, a figure stepped out. She was barefoot, her beautiful gown shredded and stained with dirt and blood. Her hair was matted to her forehead, and a nasty purple bruise covered her left cheekbone. But it wasn't fear in her eyes as she looked at her husband. She was holding a loaded revolver, and it was pointed directly at Matteo's chest. "Don't take another step," Clara said, her voice shaking violently from the freezing cold, but completely devoid of the warmth he had known for 5 years. "Clara, put the gun down, honey. It's me. I came for you," Matteo pleaded, dropping his rifle to the floor and raising his hands, taking a slow step forward. "I said stay back," she screamed, cocking the hammer of the revolver. The sound echoed like a cannon in the small room. Matteo froze. "What are you doing? I'm here to take you home." Clara laughed, a dry, broken sound that chilled him more than the ambient temperature. "Home? To the man who set up my brother?" Matteo's breath hitched. "Clara, Thaddeus set him up. Thaddeus betrayed us. Thaddeus was a dog on a leash." Clara spat, tears finally spilling over her bruised cheeks, freezing instantly in the cold air. "While I was tied to that chair, Declan Murphy thought it would be funny to tell me the truth. He played me an audio recording, Matteo, a recording of you negotiating with the cartel. You ordered the raid on Peter's warehouse yourself to prove to the cartel that you could seize federal assets. Matteo felt the world tilt on its axis. The terrible, crushing weight of his sins had finally caught up to him. "Clara," Matteo whispered, knowing the lie was over. the carefully constructed facade of his marriage shattering into a million irreparable pieces on the freezing floor. "You didn't leave me in that garage because of your pride, Matteo," she said, her grip on the gun tightening, her eyes filled with an unbearable, profound hatred. "You left me there because you knew they were coming for me. You used me as bait." The temperature inside the deep freezer hovered at a brutal 10 degrees below zero. Plumes of white vapor escaped Clara's lips with every ragged breath she took. The heavy steel door behind her was a solid wall, leaving her nowhere to run. She held the heavy, silver-plated Colt Python with both hands, the barrel aimed squarely at the center of Matteo's chest. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, not just from the bone-chilling cold, but from the cataclysmic betrayal that had just shattered her reality. "I heard your voice, Matteo," Clara sobbed, her finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. "Declan played it for me on his phone. You told the cartel liaisons that Peter was a liability. You told them to authorize the federal raid on his logistics company so you could seize the weapons for your own men without technically breaking the truce. You threw my brother to the wolves." Matteo stood perfectly still, his hands raised, his dark eyes locked onto his wife. The tactical gear felt impossibly heavy on his shoulders. He didn't look at the gun. He looked at the purple, swollen bruise on her cheek, feeling a surge of self-loathing so potent it tasted like ash in his mouth. "Clara, listen to me very carefully," Matteo said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the humming of the refrigeration units. "I did order the raid." "That part is true." Clara let out a devastated gasp, the confirmation hitting her like a physical blow. She took a step back, the heel of her bare foot slipping slightly on the frosted concrete. "You monster! You promised me my family would be safe." "I ordered the raid to keep him safe!" Matteo roared, the sudden volume making Clara flinch. He lowered his hands an inch, stepping into the dim light. "Your brother is not a victim, Clara. He didn't just stumble into smuggling. He has been skimming off the cartel's shipments for 6 months. He owed them $4 million, and they were going to execute him and put his head in a box on our doorstep." Clara stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. No, Peter wouldn't do that. He's just a businessman. He is a greedy, stupid kid who got in bed with the Sinaloa cartel," Matteo countered harshly, stepping closer, ignoring the gun. "I tipped off Captain Fordell to raid the warehouse under federal jurisdiction. I paid the feds to seize the guns so the cartel would assume the shipment was lost to law enforcement, not stolen by Peter. I was trying to buy his life, Clara. I bought the raid to erase his debt." "Then what about the recording?" she cried out, desperation cracking her voice. "You said I was the bait. You said leaving me at the Drake was part of the plan to draw Declan out." "That is a lie," Matteo stated, his voice dropping to a fierce, emotional whisper. "Thaddeus Russell betrayed us. He's the one who brought Declan into the city. He took my voice, Clara. He took audio of my negotiations, sliced the files, and stitched them together to make you think I sold you out. He wanted to break me. And the only way to break me is to turn you against me." Clara hesitated. The conviction in Matteo's eyes was absolute. For 5 years she had known the ruthless Mafia boss, but she had also known the man who woke up at 3 a.m. to hold her when she had a nightmare. The man standing in front of her was bleeding, exhausted, and looking at her with a desperate, naked vulnerability she had never seen before. "I left you in that garage because of my stupid, fragile pride," Matteo confessed, a single tear escaping his eye and freezing on his cheek. "I was angry. I was arrogant, and it is the greatest regret of my life. but I would burn the entire world to the ground before I ever intentionally put you in harm's way. Please, Clara, put the gun down. Let me take you home." Slowly, agonizingly, Clara lowered the Colt Python. The heavy metal clattered to the frosted floor. She collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her freezing, blood-stained hands, sobbing hysterically. Matteo rushed forward, falling to his knees beside her. He immediately stripped off his heavy Kevlar vest and his ruined suit jacket, wrapping the thick, warm wool around her shivering shoulders. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her matted hair, whispering frantic apologies. For a fleeting moment, in the freezing dark, they were just a husband and a wife, clinging to each other in the wreckage. But the Mafia doesn't allow for happy reunions. A slow, mocking applause echoed through the open freezer door. Matteo's head snapped up. Standing in the threshold, illuminated by the harsh industrial lights of the processing room, was Declan Murphy. His face was covered in a sheer mask of blood from a graze wound on his forehead, and he held a military-grade Sig Sauer pointed directly at Clara's back. "Touching," Declan sneered, his Irish brogue dripping with venom. "Truly bloody touching, Falcone. But I'm afraid this is where the romance novel ends." Matteo instinctively positioned his body between Clara and the mercenary, his hand discreetly inching toward the combat knife strapped to his thigh. His rifle was out of reach, dropped at the entrance. "It's over, Declan. My men have the building surrounded. You're the last man standing." "Oh, I doubt that," Declan chuckled darkly. "Your men are currently dealing with a secondary assault team I had waiting in the loading bays. The cartel doesn't play games, Matteo, and neither does my employer." "Thaddeus is dead," Matteo spat. "Your employer is rotting in the mud in Cicero." Declan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Thaddeus? You think that sniveling underboss was running this operation? Thaddeus was just a middleman, a useful idiot." Declan stepped into the freezer, his boots crunching on the ice. He kept the gun leveled. "Come on in, boss. Let's show the happy couple who's really running Chicago now." From the shadows behind Declan, another figure emerged. He was wearing a pristine cashmere overcoat, his hair perfectly styled, completely untouched by the violence that had ravaged the building. Clara gasped, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror escaping her throat. It was Peter. Peter stepped into the freezing room, a calm, chilling smile playing on his lips. He looked at his sister, huddled on the floor wrapped in Matteo's coat, and then at Matteo, who was staring back at him with a murderous, calculating silence. "Hello, Clara," Peter said gently, as if they were meeting for Sunday brunch at the country club. "I'm sorry you had to get roughed up tonight. It was an unfortunate necessity to draw your husband away from his fortress." "Peter, what are you doing?" Clara whispered, her mind refusing to process the reality in front of her. He said, "Matteo said he ordered the raid to save you." "Oh, Matteo's right about that," Peter sighed, pulling a pair of leather gloves from his coat pocket and slipping them on. "He did try to save me. But what my dear brother-in-law failed to realize is that I didn't need saving. The raid was an inconvenience, Matteo. You destroyed $3 million worth of perfectly good merchandise because you thought I was in over my head." Matteo slowly rose to his feet, keeping Clara behind him. "You set this up. You allied with the cartel to overthrow the family. The family is a dinosaur, Matteo," Peter snapped, his calm facade cracking to reveal a simmering, arrogant ambition. "You're sitting on a gold mine in this city, but you refuse to run narcotics. You refuse to traffic for the cartel because of your precious morals. You're losing millions. The cartel wanted a new distribution hub in the Midwest, and they needed a boss who was willing to play ball. I offered them my logistics network, and in return, they offered me your throne. You kidnapped your own sister, Matteo growled, his muscles tensing, preparing for a strike that he knew might end his life. I borrowed her, Peter corrected coldly. I knew Thaddeus had a grudge against you, so I used him to hire Declan. I knew you would tear the city apart looking for Clara. You made yourself vulnerable, Matteo. You let your heart dictate your strategy. In this business, that makes you weak. Clara pushed herself up, using the wall, her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce fire that rivaled her husband's. You are not my brother. You're a coward. You hid behind mercenaries because you knew Matteo would tear you to pieces if you faced him like a man. Peter's eyes flashed with anger. He drew a polished chrome beretta from his coat. Careful, Clara. Don't make me do something I'll regret. When Matteo is dead, I'll take over the Falcone Empire. I can give you the life you've always wanted. Legitimate wealth. No more looking over your shoulder. I would rather die than take a dime from you, Clara spat. Declan cocked his cig sour. Enough family therapy. Kill him, Peter, so we can get out of here. The sirens are getting closer. Peter raised the beretta, pointing it directly at Matteo's forehead. Any last words, Don Falcone? Matteo didn't look at Peter. He looked over his shoulder at Clara, his eyes softening, stripping away the ruthless boss to reveal the man underneath. I love you. Don't look. Matteo lunged. He didn't dive for cover. He dove directly into the line of fire, launching his massive frame toward Declan, recognizing the mercenary as the primary threat. The freezer erupted in deafening noise. Peter fired, the bullet tearing through Matteo's shoulder, spinning him backward. But Matteo's momentum carried him forward just enough. As Declan raised his gun to shoot Matteo in the chest, Clara let out a feral scream. She had kicked out with her bare foot, sliding the heavy Colt python she had dropped earlier across the ice. It hit Matteo's knee. Through the agonizing pain of the gunshot wound, muscle memory took over. Matteo dropped to the ice, scooping up the Colt in one fluid, desperate motion. He didn't even aim. He pointed the heavy revolver toward Declan's center of mass and pulled the trigger twice. The massive point, .357 Magnum rounds, hit Declan Murphy with the force of a freight train, lifting the Irish mercenary off his feet and slamming him into the steel wall. He slid to the frosted floor, dead before he stopped moving. Peter panicked. Seeing his lethal enforcer go down, he wildly aimed his beretta at Matteo, who was struggling to raise his weapon with a shattered shoulder. Die! Peter screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Bang! But the shot didn't come from Peter. A 3-round burst of high-velocity rifle fire tore through the open doorway of the freezer. Peter's chest exploded in a shower of crimson, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He dropped his gun, looking down at his ruined cashmere coat before collapsing heavily onto the ice. Standing in the doorway, smoke curling from the barrel of his M4, was Lucas. He was bleeding from a shrapnel wound on his cheek, his combat gear torn, but his eyes were locked on his boss. Told you to wait for the breach, boss, Lucas grunted, lowering his weapon. Matteo dropped the heavy Colt, his vision swimming as the blood loss caught up to him. He fell backward onto the ice, his breathing shallow and rapid. Matteo! Clara screamed, scrambling across the freezing floor. She threw herself onto his chest, pressing her freezing, blood-stained hands over the gaping wound in his shoulder. No, look at me. Keep your eyes open. I got you, Matteo wheezed, managing a weak, bloody smile. He reached up with his good hand, gently cupping her bruised cheek, his thumb brushing away her tears. I didn't leave you. I came back. I know, she sobbed, pressing her forehead against his. I know you did. Just stay with me. Lucas, Matteo choked out, his eyes fluttering shut. Get her. Get her out of here. The world faded into a freezing, silent black. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the opulent, private VIP suite of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Sunlight streamed through the large bay windows, casting a warm, golden glow over the crisp white sheets. Matteo Falcone opened his eyes. His body felt as heavy as lead, pumped full of morphine and antibiotics. His left arm was heavily bandaged and immobilized in a sling. He blinked against the sunlight, taking in the sterile surroundings. Sitting in a leather chair beside his bed, reading a paperback novel, was Frank. Welcome back to the land of the living, boss, Frank said quietly, closing the book and standing up. You had us worried there for a minute. How long? Matteo rasped, his throat feeling like sandpaper. 3 days, Frank replied, pouring a cup of ice water and holding the straw to Matteo's lips. Surgery was a success. Bullet missed the artery by a fraction of an inch. Dr. Finch handled the paperwork, so there are no police records of the gunshot wound. Matteo drank greedily, his mind racing to catch up. The freezer. Declan. The gunshot. Peter. Where is she? Matteo asked, his heart rate spiking on the monitor. Where is Clara? Frank looked down at his shoes, his posture shifting uncomfortably. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. He placed it gently on the tray table across Matteo's lap. She waited here for 2 days, boss. Didn't sleep, barely ate. Just sat right where I'm sitting, holding your hand, Frank said softly. When the doctors said you were stabilized and completely out of the woods, she packed a bag. Matteo stared at the white envelope, a cold dread washing over him that was entirely different from the freezing temperatures of the meatpacking plant. Packed a bag. Lucas drove her to O'Hare this morning, Frank explained, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. She took a private charter. She said to tell you she's sorry, but she can't. Matteo didn't ask where she went. He knew Lucas wouldn't tell him, and he knew he wouldn't ask. He slowly reached out with his good hand and opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of stationery written in Clara's elegant, sweeping handwriting. Matteo, if you are reading this, it means you are alive, and for that, I will thank God every single day for the rest of my life. You saved me. You bled for me. You proved to me that the man I fell in love with is still inside you. But Matteo, I cannot stay. I looked at my brother, my own flesh and blood, and saw a monster created by the world we live in. This life is a poison. It corrupts everything it touches. It corrupted Thaddeus. It corrupted Peter. And if I stay, I know it will eventually corrupt us until there is nothing left but ash and blood. You told me once that you do what you have to do to protect your empire. But an empire built on graves is just a cemetery. I cannot be the queen of a cemetery. I am leaving you the house, the cars, the money. I don't want any of it. I just want peace. Do not look for me, my love. Let me be the ghost that reminds you to find a better path. I forgive you for the garage. I hope, one day, you can forgive me for leaving. Always, Clara. Matteo read the letter twice. He didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. Instead, a profound, hollow silence settled into his chest. The space where his heart used to beat wildly for his wife was now utterly empty. Boss? Frank asked nervously. Do you want me to track the tail number of the charter plane? We can find her within 24 hours. Matteo stared out the window, looking at the sprawling, glittering skyline of Chicago. The city he ruled. The city he had bled for. It looked cold. It looked entirely meaningless. He slowly folded the letter, slipping it under his pillow, directly next to his heart. "No, Frank," Matteo said, his voice terrifyingly devoid of emotion. The warmth he had cultivated for 5 years was gone, replaced by the unyielding, ruthless ice of a Mafia king. "Let her go. Call Lucas. Tell him to gather the capos. We have a lot of new territory to claim from the cartel, and I want every single one of their men in Cook County buried before the end of the week." "Understood, boss." Frank nodded, stepping back into the shadows of the room. Matteo closed his eyes, accepting his fate. He had chosen his pride in the garage that night, and the universe had exacted its toll. He was the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld once again. Untouchable, unstoppable, and entirely, permanently alone. After a fight, the Mafia boss refused to drive his wife home. The next morning she was gone is a tragic reminder that in the criminal underworld, love is a luxury no one can truly afford. Matteo Falcone won his war, conquered his enemies, and secured his empire. But he lost the only treasure that actually mattered. Clara's departure wasn't just an escape from the violence. It was the ultimate consequence of Matteo's pride, and a stark realization that you cannot build a life of light in a world governed by shadows. Betrayal runs deeper than blood, and sometimes the only way to win the game is to walk away entirely. Did Clara make the right choice? Should Matteo have left his empire for her? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share this gripping story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life Mafia romance dramas. Turn on notifications so you never miss a twist.